Hello, my name is Ken Hess. I'm a retired Air Force Major General. I was the Air Force Chief of Safety at the time of the shuttle mishap occurred back in 2003. At the time the shuttle mishap occurred, I was the Air Force Chief of Safety, and as a consequence of that position, I was part of a contingency plan to investigate any major shuttle mishap that may occur while I had the Chief of Safety hat. As the investigation board began to assume its position in Barksdale, Admiral Gaiman had us all sequestered in a room and trying to sort through how to go through what was essentially a team building exercise. I'm sure he was trying to figure out who he had in the room and then what the context of the investigation would be and what it would be about. So there was a very long and important discussion that took place on the style of the investigation and what rules, if you prefer that term, we were going to use as we investigated. With people from the Navy, people from the Air Force, people from the FAA, there was a lot of differing opinions about how the investigation should proceed based on the history that we brought with us to the table. I think fundamentally, after a fairly protracted discussion, we began to hone in on the fact that the process of the investigation was not nearly as important as how we were going to treat the investigation in terms of mishap prevention and how we were going to be able to take the lessons that we were about to get from our investigation and give them back to NASA in a way that they could be used to benefit the future. So the big issue to us became after about an hour or so of discussion, it came to be how are we going to treat the interviews and anonymity of the people we talk to, and how are we going to protect the information that we get so that we get to ground truth and find out, actual causes and not make everybody feel like they needed a lawyer in order to talk to us. The big lesson from that is that every big team that's going to come together that's never worked together before is going to have to go through a little bit of team building and a discussion on the style of investigation and what you think that format ought to look like really was a pretty good step in team building. You get to hear from everybody, their background, their expertise. You learn who they are and how they think about a particular problem which nobody really knows the answer to. And so the lesson was it was probably a good thing to have occur in the process. Now, I will say that fundamentally the important lesson that we get out of the point here is that can NASA, as a big organization, when they have a major failure like a shuttle loss, can they have an investigation that will allow them to protect and then use it as a mishap prevention tool as opposed to the certain public pulling from NASA to have hold people accountable and that kind of thing. Certainly that is part of any investigation, but if you want to find out why it happened, you're not really so worried about who done it as you are about what occurred, what decisions were made, what the processes were that led up to the mishap so that you can deconstruct the important elements for you. Probably one of the biggest shortfalls for the team at large was the fact that none of us were really immersed in NASA, the shuttle program, all of its constituent parts, and the sheer complexity of the shuttle system that we were about to encounter as we began to do the investigation. As I mentioned in my intro, as the Air Force Chief of Safety, I was named in a contingency plan as the Air Force Chief of Safety would be on this team. And there was a plan to get me to NASA and take me through a fairly rigorous 2-day program of indoctrinating me into shuttle. What is it? What's it? How does it work? Introducing me to how do you get something from the Earth into orbit, all the mechanics and stuff that would have been absolutely fundamental to getting a quick start on the ground. I hadn't done that training yet, so when we arrived at Barksdale and then moved down to Houston, one of the very first things we needed to do as a team was to learn about the shuttle and the system. Some members of the team were more versed than others because they had touches with NASA. Hubbard, for example, came from the NASA community, so he was pretty aware. Gaiman, astute throughout the whole process, laid out a plan that we had to get some indoctrination. He himself, being very much of a detail guy, wanted to know lots of information about it. He didn't want anybody to restrict his ability to sponge up information early to learn about the shuttle program. He got books for us to read, background for us to get, briefings after briefing, and then we basically went on a tour of the essential elements to make sure that we had a good, firm understanding of the depth, breadth, and complexity of where this investigation might take us. You could have done that stuff ahead of time. I don't know that it necessarily had to be done ahead of time. It probably was another one of those good learning steps that the team got to do together, which was good in building our cross-team communication, because we were asking each other questions and what do you think throughout that whole process. And so it was another team-building exercise that was pretty fundamental, and it made sure everybody started with the same base of information. Had I not had that, there might have been an attempt to kind of short-circuit it as though we don't need it, and you would have missed the team-building part of it. So good fundamental step, absolutely essential that you get out there and study the breadth and depth of the process before you get started. One of the first things that we did by going to Barksdale was get an opportunity to go out into the field and watch a massive operation underway to begin to collect as much of the shuttle debris as we could possibly find. And we're in and around Nacogdoches, Texas at the time, and we're living in this little Motel 6 operation and walking out there and seeing the people all over the landscape through the National Forest out there walking around trying to find pieces of this shuttle. And that was, okay, there's been a mishap here, and they're picking up pieces of the shuttle. But as you begin to back yourself out of Nacogdoches, Texas, to the God's eye view, and begin to get a perspective that this shuttle mishap starts out in Texas and ends up all the way through Louisiana, with some parts going into the panhandle of Florida, by the time you get it finished, you begin to see that, there's nothing that we can do with the ability, with our necessity to collect up the pieces of the shuttle that remain. It's just too enormous. You can't fathom it. I liken it back to, at the Air Force Safety Center, we have what we call the boneyard of mishaps, where we take fighters that have crashed and we spread them out just like they were when they crashed. And there may be 150 yards worth of stuff here, and we're talking 2.5 states worth of debris. And so there is no context for it. I mean, it is just going to be a massive undertaking. And I think that's the first time the board really had their eyes open for themselves to look at this. How are we ever going to piece this back together again in a rational way where we can prove that we know what happened? I think the lesson for me in taking a look at this, it wasn't the size of the mishap. It is an understanding of, at some point, you're going to be able to walk it back and decide what the critical failures may or may not have been. The fact that it was a large debris field was a consequence of the fact that there was a failure that happened much earlier in the flight. So I was able to try to concentrate on just the operational elements, because I knew that Admiral Gaiman was going to kind of put me and my team looking at those kinds of things about what were the operational decisions that any air boss would have made to launch the shuttle, to bring the shuttle back home, and the training that went into it. And so from that context, I put it into just an airplane mishap, bigger, granted a lot bigger, a lot more complex with a lot more moving parts, but looking for the operational decisions that were made, and why did they make them, and did they make the right choices at the right time that led up to the mishap. After we pulled ourselves out of the debris field and decided we needed to go to NASA and sit down at not at the Washington, D.C. headquarters, but a fundamental decision to be down where the operation was run from, and where all the major decisions were woven through and all the money was executed, that was the place we needed to be, because that's kind of like being down in the line of scrimmage with the folks who are blocking and tackling and making the operation move. Great decision. But the fundamental problem became okay, when we get there, what are we going to do? What is this going to mean to us? Now, if you remember, we're from Barksdale out to the debris field, now we're down at Johnson, and we still don't really have an idea about what are we going to go look at. Gaiman is probably in the back of his mind. I hate to speak for him, so I don't imply that I am, but he's probably trying to say, okay, who do I have on the team? What's the expertise that I've got? And as he began to parse the team apart and to see what the constituent elements were, he had guys like in the Air Force, myself as the chief of safety, but an operational background. He had John Barry, who had some opportunity with Challenger, so he had some background on an investigation like this, and certainly the political that was going to happen as part of it. He had Dwayne Deal, who was a space guy, who understood space operations and space control, but had never obviously been into space. And operational backgrounds, logistics backgrounds, and stuff like that. So how are you going to take those leadership talents and use them on the team? You set that aside, and you have highly technical people that were there with Hubbard and Osheroff and some others that were brought in. And I'm pretty sure that if you were going to take a look at the operation at a macro sense early on, you had these technical people that were going to be able to look at technical problems, and you had operational people that might be able to take a look at where you're fundamentally operating a system like the rules said you were supposed to operate it. Then you had to break it down even further than that. You know, once they began to bring pieces of the debris in, and we began to understand that there were some parts that were hotter than others, you know, it gave us opportunities over time to really start to hone the investigation into interesting directions. But for Hess and for Deal and for the Air Force contingent, basically, if you will, we were going to stay in the ops, training, reviewing, mission management team, those kinds of things where it was conceptually very easy for us to understand the decision processes that were being made and how they were applied to launching that particular science mission and then the events that led up to the mishap. The technical side was going to concentrate on, you know, what really happened to the shuttle. And so that very initial breakdown led into, as the investigation unfolded, being able to take a look at, I think there were about 5 lines of investigation that we ended up taking a look at, and Gaiman's very, very earnest desire to keep those lines of investigation separate so that they couldn't bleed one into the other and then bias it. You had to kind of come up with your own conclusion in these very narrow lanes that he had us drawing, many of them technical, but nonetheless, at the end of the day, he wanted to have many smoking guns pointing at the same thing for fear that you wouldn't actually ever be able to come up with the exact thing that happened. As it turned out, we found out, I think, with great clarity exactly what happened. So the 5 proofs were not necessary, but the 5 lines of investigation held until the very end of what we were doing. In the ops area, we had a lot of very interesting personalities that came to play there. So there was a lot of that needed to be done about our own little team building that went on. We had myself, for reasons of, I think, just pulling the short straw, I was asked to lead the group. We had Dwayne Deal, we had John Barry. Later on in the investigation, we had Sally Ride, and then probably in the middle of the investigation, we pick up Diane Vaughn because of her history with Challenger, and Steve Wallace from the FAA, and so a more disparate group of people you're probably never going to put into a room, and so over the course of probably 2 or 3 weeks, as we began to take a look at what the operational span was that we were going to take a look at, we kind of divided up the pieces of investigation and the ops side that we wanted to investigate and dig into. Steve Wallace was a crew escape. Sally Ride was brought in, and she started looking at the NASA clock being pressure on them, pressure for launch, and because she was still connected and very, very highly respected, she was able to get in and investigate and find out things in the NASA organization that the rest of us may not have been able to get from the organization just from a factor of trust. Dwayne Deal was looking at maintenance. Were they deferring maintenance on the shuttle in ways that might have led to the mishap? John Barry was helping Admiral Gaiman on the political side just a little bit, but also on the operational side, taking a look at some of the decisions that were made in some of the mission management teams and some elements like that. And myself, I was really focusing on trying to figure out how to tie all that together. As we got Diane Vaughn, and I think one of the big transition days was when Sally Ride made the comment about voices of Challenger being heard, or words to that effect, and which really brought up the stature of what Diane Vaughn was going to be able to do in terms of encapsulating her concepts earlier in Challenger of this normalization of deviance. And how does that play? How does it play in organizational culture for this 17 years later to have another major mishap, and where there's strings that could be tied across all the pieces together? A lot of team dinners. We pulled the trick. We got a lava lamp out and put it on everybody's desk who was touching this thing here. A lot of people thought it was, kind of gimmicky, but what I was trying to do was when you walked into a room, I wanted everybody that had a lava lamp to understand that they were part of a bigger process that was going on, and that there were people that they needed to talk to across all of these different pieces of the investigation. Now, specifically, there were people that needed to help me in looking to things that I really needed to grasp. I picked on Rick Burgess, who was the head of my ops investigation team back at the Air Force Safety Center. As a fighter pilot and a clear thinker, he would have been able to sit down and talk to astronauts or talk to anybody like that, and not come off as he was trying to run roughshod over anybody. He was innately curious. He was very smart and very detailed, and able to do that piece very, very well. Don White, also known as Two Dogs, was a human factors guy. How can we classify any errors that we might find, and how can you put human factors and a human factors calculus into the investigation, both from an organization and an individual level, so that we can start to get to themes, work from small to big, so that when we put the investigation report together, you can have something that's worthy of actually reading when you get done. We talked about Diane Vaughn. We talked about the pieces that Sally was bringing into it, that all of it kind of end up pinching on the organization, organizational decision processes, and organizational culture. And then you had Gaiman looking back at this thing here of that whole thing over time, from the beginning that of NASA and the Shuttle program to Challenger, and then from that 17-year period from Challenger to us. What were the major themes that we could screed out of all this thing here and talk about? So the ops process settled over a long period of time. It took a lot of communication, a lot of work in the middle of the night, and then a lot of meetings together to talk about what are you doing, where are you, how's this progressing. And the fact that I think that each of those individuals had clear lines of things that were theirs, it kept us from trying to compete one with the other as we began to put it together, and everybody's input as we began to coalesce on the chapters in the book that we end up writing made it, I think, a consistent story after the technical. I can remember when we got to Houston, we've been concentrating a lot on the technical piece, and the technical piece was up and running, and it was charging ahead, and the whole piece about looking at the operation, stuff like that, was really was forming late. Its ideas about what it was going to do were really kind of behind what the rest of the organization had been doing up to that point. It wasn't critical because it was still fairly early, but we were behind in terms of where we were maturity-wise in the investigation. One of the things we talked to Gaiman about, because of my background at the Safety Center, and was, we need to take a look at how NASA as an organization deals with the risk of the shuttle. How do they deal with, what's their decision processes look like, and how are they as a safety organization? Do they have the culture for safety that's going to back this thing up? And Gaiman initially was resistant. He thought, we got this technical thing going over here, and I'm not real sure that's going to lead us anyplace. But he said, prove it to me. So we got several people from industry to come in and talk to him about organizations that deal with risk, and organizations that deal with the potential for great loss, and how do they work the culture in terms of training their people, holding people accountable, processes, how do they weave all that together? And we were able to convince him that there are major corporations in the United States who are adamant that the safety programs are not just programs, they're part of how we live and breathe in the organization, because the product that they produce is tied to that ability to think in terms of everything has a person, everything has a decision, everything has a safety aspect to it, and you cannot separate them. They've got to come together. And at the top of the organization, if the leadership is not imbued of the value of safety and safety processes and working on the safety culture, then the organization will begin to think it's not important. The risk will go up unseen to the organization, and one of these days you're going to face a major, major mishap. So that kind of line of logic, Admiral Gavin kind of gave us the green light to go start taking a look at organization, process, safety, and culture as the larger piece. And I think that was kind of the foreshadowing, if you will, of the fact that there was probably going to end up being a technical cause that the brilliant people that were part of the team were looking at, and then us social science majors were over here trying to look at culture and understand it in a way that was reasonable. Now, very important to me is, and I worked a lot of this, is I knew that we had at great risk the ability to have 20/20 hindsight into, oh, why'd you do that? Or why didn't you do this? And that was what we were trying to stay away from. We wanted to deal with very factual things, but yet still use them to help paint a palette, if you will, a watercolor of how does all that blend together, and what really was taking place in the organization that might not have been seen by the organization itself, and do it in a way that was fair, because I was convinced that NASA was probably one of the brightest organizations I'd ever been around. So how can this happen? I kind of thought it going in, but I wasn't, I'd only been in the Air Force safety business for about a year, and I was able, from the experience on the shuttle, to step back and say that, no mishap that we have in the United States Air Force, F-16 tail number XYZ just crashed, and it crashed because the pilot didn't put the gear down. Sign off on the report and you're done. No, you're not. You need to walk those lines of investigation back further. And as a consequence of what we did in the Columbia mishap, I was able to convince the Air Force leadership to tie the human factors taxonomy to every investigation, and so there was a scoring, if you will, of all the human factors elements back that would lead to mishaps, that got to organizational decision making, individual decision making, skill-based errors, all those kind of things, so you could actually try to find out if your training programs were contributory in any degree, or a decision to press the launch. I've got to get this sortie out the door. All those kind of things that you don't typically pull up in a regular investigation. We're now starting to become part of a holistic look at how we take a look at the organization. And you're able to see, you can draw lines of decision all the way back to major command commanders and what they're deciding and how they're translating their goals and objectives out to the field would have influence on whether or not somebody's going to press on a particular sortie or not, or whether somebody's going to tie the technical training I just bought to the widget and make sure that when you put something in an airplane and go out and fly it, that they're all matched up, that the training and the operation are matched together and resourced so that you can do something for good out there. The organization that we got introduced to at NASA, first of all, from a person who didn't know anything about NASA, you step back and begin to see the constituent elements of highly professional, brilliant people that have been dedicated to the space mission for all of their lives, most of them that we were dealing with. And it was just really kind of awesome to kind of witness this thing. And it gave you pause. If you had people that were this sharp, this dedicated, and so very, very good at the jobs that they were doing, then how then as an organization, did they deal with risk, or how did they view the risk that they were dealing with? And it was profound over the course of the time that I was there to come to the realization through the terms and the taxonomy, in family, not in family, and words to that effect. You built a whole dialogue that enabled you to accept very, very high risk things as though they were normal. And I would imagine that any organization that runs on a level of risk adrenaline like that after a while gets used to that high. Because if you probably took time to say, you know, this decision could cause us to not fly a mission, but we've flown the missions with the same problem before, and you do that enough times over history, then that becomes normal. And so it's hard to put it into a context of how really dangerous it is. Kelly Beck used to talk about how she'd lose sleep, you know, before a shuttle launch when she was going to be out there as part of the team. And so that accommodation kind of led you to take a look at how the organization dealt with the risks that it had and what it was doing with it. And I truly believe that not that they disregarded the risk, not that the risk wasn't important, but they got so used to it that it was just a normal course of everyday events there. And so when something really wrong was coming up, it didn't raise the bar that much when it probably should have. And the evidence of that, I think, lies into the fact that, you know, in this investigation, we saw that piece of foam come off, we saw it hit the wing, and there was really hardly even a speed bump that happened in the mission processes. And it's not because these are not bright people. They've been dealing with that for years, and it colored their ability to see it as the threat that it was. Once Admiral Gaiman kind of gave us the green light to take a look at the organization safety and culture and how that may have influenced the events that led up to the loss of Columbia, our organization, which we described earlier, kind of fanned out into the entire training apparatus, the operational decision making, and we're plugged into the folks who were looking at mission management team and, you know, all the launch teams that had to happen, you know, the rollout, the fueling, all that kind of stuff that needed to be done, just to make sure that all those processes were followed in accordance with the NASA procedures. And it, you know, and the report validates all that stuff happened just exactly like it was supposed to happen. But the point I'm getting at here is we were kind of everywhere all over that particular organization, and trying to gather information, and it was going to be different than the technical side. You know, the technical side says what happened, you know, why did it burn through, you know, those are very scientific things. I'm coming to a decision maker, and I'm asking questions about the decisions they made, and the almost certain feeling on the other side is going to be, you're looking at me because you don't think I did something right. And because of that, I kind of instructed the team that we were going to be very quiet about what we were looking at. Because I wasn't real sure where any of that was going to go. I don't know if we were going to find a problem in any of those areas or not. And so consciously, Steve Wallace and I and others, whenever we had a chance to talk to the press and stuff like that, we stayed out of that limelight because I didn't want to just by something I might say casually cause somebody to start thinking that we were looking at an area in particular or a person in particular, or the fact that we thought the NASA decision making was all broken and that kind of stuff. So the decision to receive the information, let's study it, let's see what it is we've got before we start acting like we understand. Because it was really like learning a foreign language to, you know, learn about all the teams and what they did and the timelines that they were on and why they made the decisions that they made. And it took, you know, almost the entirety of the investigation to be able to boil it down to a level that where we thought we had what I would consider to be credible information that we could back up and stand behind. And so there wasn't any need for us to go out there and be very public about what we were doing. But if anybody came and asked me what I was looking at, I was more than happy to talk to them about it. I just didn't want to be on the point because I didn't think that others who weren't part of the process we were using could handle that with the same level of maturity and discretion that I thought it needed. The lesson, I think, for all of us in the investigation is if you talk this investigation in its entirety, is that if a board gets formed of the style of CAIB, you're going to get into organization, you're going to get into decision processes, and I believe that you ought to be able to conduct that investigation publicly, and so the public needs to know what you're doing. And you know, we had all kinds of press conference meetings and stuff like that. But that doesn't mean you necessarily need to kind of open your kimono and tell them everything that you're doing until you've are on firm ground with and organizational kinds of things. It's going to come late. It's going to all come together very, very late. And I think you just ought to fold your hands and continue your level of inquiry until you're confident that you know that you've got the issues surrounded and are able to articulate them cleanly. There were several investigations going on at the same time. You know, the CAIB had its elements that were happening, and then internal to NASA, there was NASA parallel investigations and lines of inquiry that they wanted to have answered themselves. And there was a coordinating piece through Randy Stone that kind of took all the work that they were doing and tried to line it up with where the CAIB was to make sure we weren't, one, being duplicative of anything that was happening. I mean, if the information had already been investigated and existed, he could get it because NASA was doing their own very serious examination internally. And so that having that conduit back and forth also kind of kept us disciplined and not just asking for the moon over and over and over and over again if stuff was there, and allowed everybody to proceed along their lines of investigation to be able to come to a logical conclusion. So the interface was critical to what was happening. When we were taking a look at the organization and culture and those kinds of things, there wasn't a parallel to that over in the NASA organization. If we wanted to look at mission management team activity, they were looking at that, but they weren't looking at it in context of, you know, how was it dealing with risk? What kind of the things were they trying to decide at the same time? How were they responding? How were they communicating back and forth? You know, that was probably one or two levels below where the NASA organization existed. So we had to be kind of careful as we went over into the organization to take a look at how all that would come together and how that might prove useful to the overall CAIB report at the same time. As the investigation began to mature and we began to have definite lines of inquiry that everybody was being involved in, you couldn't escape the fact that there was going to be overlap between the various lines of investigation because we didn't define them all that cleanly to begin with, and then some decision processes frankly just influenced lots of lines of investigation. And so we started finding back through our NASA interface that we're probably overworking it out there. We're too much demand on the system for information. Do you really need it? Somebody else is already having it. And so one of the things that happened as a result of that is Gaiman asked all of us, the principal investigators, to make sure that we were disciplined in what we were looking at, and that, you know, the process that we were going to put in place was designated investigators, because we established another level of hierarchy, you know, as Gaiman and his team, and then below us, each of us nominated 2 or 3 what we'd call principal investigators, or so that they had a little bit more authority to ask for information. If they asked for it, then it was important. And that kept us from having to worry about serious levels of detail that were below where we ought to be concentrating as they were doing their jobs, taking a look at it. But it also kept the hundreds of people from having the same ability to demand of the NASA organization information or inquiry or investigation on just into what their little wiki-up was taking a look at. So it was a system of setting up some controls and some balance into our investigation, because by the time we got into full swing, we were everywhere. There were hundreds of us looking at hundreds of things, and we were very quickly going to be able to drown the NASA organization and really interfere with their investigation, their normal ops, as well as probably put in jeopardy the ability to support the CAIB in getting their stuff done if we didn't have more discipline. As we were forming the team that was looking at the operational piece of this thing here, the lesson that we brought out of the Air Force Safety Center, at least for my element of it, was that you needed to have an outline and a little bit of a structure to start with. Even though it may not be the final one that you've got, you have to start writing things down and putting things on paper. You can't just collect a bunch of information, a bunch of facts on slips of paper and hope to be successful when it comes time to write a report, because you won't be able to put it together in a timely fashion. So writing from day one was something we concentrated on. We set up the basic structure just based on what subject we were looking at, mission management team, which later folded into decision processes, and we were able to build a structure that was bigger than the individual elements as we went through the investigation and it began to take some shape. But fundamental that, you spent a lot of time at the end of every day after you spent some time investigating some certain things. You took the information you got that day and you plugged it in to the report where you thought it best fit, realizing that we're going to be able to edit out any gross errors or any overlap that was going to be in the report. And I don't think you would have been able to put the report together when it came time to try to finish. And finishing was a major objective that Gaiman had as we were starting to near the end of our time at Johnson. He was starting to sense that we weren't adding much more value. We weren't getting very much further than we needed to be. He was pretty satisfied after we were in San Antonio and shot the RCC that, okay, I've got this technical thing coming to a close. I need to figure out how to bring the operational piece to a close. We end up in the Answer building up in Washington, D.C., and we've got our files of things we've started, and he wants this thing to come to a close, and was fairly demanding that we begin to try to come off and have a strategy that gets us out of it. We wouldn't have been able to get there if we hadn't been writing information and documenting it, because we could get up to Washington, D.C. and start to put some gross mass structure to it. And then the team meetings that he had, putting the investigators together, talking about the format, this is kind of how I see it going, how's it come together, how are you doing on this piece, how are you doing on that piece, were very, very important in being able to tie a knot in this thing here that had a logical conclusion to the end of it. So starting early, writing all the way through, capturing the documentation that you thought you might need for the report, and then figuring out how the little pieces were going to tie together to the larger theme became the effort that we were able to concentrate on by the time we got to Washington to write. My key takeaway from the Columbia mishap investigation has to be that leadership counts. It's offset, everybody understands it, but in very interesting ways, we were able to see that that the decisions that leaders make inform others who make other decisions that those leaders may not see throughout the entirety of an organization. And when you're dealing with an organization like NASA, who has very, very high risk outcomes as part of their normal everyday business, the way the leadership informs its staff by the decisions it makes, the way it spends its money and stuff like that, have the ability to influence the style and culture of the organization in ways that the leader probably can't appreciate. But if part of your decision process as a leader is to understand your role in setting the style and the culture that decisions are made in for your particular organization, if you're sensitive to that, not just stand up and say, well, you all go be safe. Are you actually making decisions that enable safety and culture to come together to be one in your organization? Then you're probably leading it in ways that are communicating up and down the tape in effective ways. The second thing I would probably say is you can't contract out your culture. You can't have a corporation buy a contract for safety and mission assurance and come in and be the same as your organization. You can pronounce that everybody's on the same team. It's a badgeless society. Anybody can say stop. You can do all those bumper stickers, but at the end of the day, it becomes who's in the organization and then who's contracted to the organization, and there's a seam there that you're never going to be able to polish over. So you need to understand the risk that you're putting in your organizational structure by virtue of the fact that you have certain elements that are not center to the organization itself. And so you look at your org chart, you say, have I created an environment that's equal and balanced, or do I have some that are greater than others in terms of how I'm going to deal with this very risky thing we call shuttle ops? And I think an appreciation for that Now, granted, this took 20 years to form. I mean, we're talking about, if you read Gaiman's comments at the beginning and the end, he's going back to the day we first decided we were going to have a shuttle, and drawing themes throughout the organization that all have something to do with this. And so I'm not suggesting that it's easy, that you can sit out there and go. You just need to be aware every day that the smallest decisions can have profound effects at the bottom of how the organization is interpreting what you want them to do.